The war had bled the color from Eli Quinn's world, leaving it in shades of dust and dried blood. He'd come back to the Wyoming territory not whole, but as a collection of pieces held together by stubbornness and silence. The limp in his right leg was a constant, biting reminder of a cannonball's kiss. But the deeper wounds were the ones no one could see. They festered in the quiet of his soul, in the hollow space where faith in things like love and forever used to live. His parents' ranch was all he had left. A small, sturdy cabin built of lodgepole pine, a barn that leaned with the prevailing wind, and 100 acres of land that was more rock and sagebrush than pasture. It was a harsh, lonely place, pressed under a sky so vast it could swallow a man's shouts without a whisper. For 2 years, this land had been his only companion. He worked from before the sun rose until his muscles screamed in protest, mending fences that held nothing in, branding the few head of longhorn cattle that were more wild than tame, and tending a small garden of potatoes and beans. The work was a penance, a physical exhaustion he hoped would one day quiet the noise in his head. It never did. The silence of the cabin was the loudest thing he knew. It was a living entity, filled with the ghosts of his mother's humming and his father's gruff laughter. He ate his meals of salted pork and beans standing by the cast-iron stove, the food tasteless in his mouth. He slept on a narrow cot, his rifle within arm's reach, and his dreams were a chaotic reel of smoke, screams, and the faces of men he'd watched die. He had learned in the war that promises were lies you told yourself before the shooting started. Marriage, family, they were promises of a different kind, just as fragile, just as easily shattered by the cruel whims of fate. He wanted no part of them. He was a man who had walled off his own heart, content to let the dust of his life settle until he, too, was nothing but a memory on the wind. Winter came to the territory not with a gentle dusting of snow, but like an invading army. It descended from the mountains with a furious, howling wind that stripped the leaves from the cottonwoods and drove every living creature to ground. The world became a stark canvas of white and gray, and the cold was a physical thing, a predator that seeped through the chinks in the cabin walls and stole the warmth from a man's bones. It was on one such day, with the snow driving horizontally and the sky the color of old iron, that Eli found her. He'd been checking his snares down by the frozen creek, a task born more of habit than hope, as he rode his stoic gelding, Abraham, back toward the cabin. A splash of color against the unrelenting white caught his eye. It was a tattered blue shawl, half buried in a snowdrift near the base of a rocky outcrop. Curiosity, a feeling so long dormant he barely recognized it, spurred him forward. She was crumpled at the base of the rocks, a small, still heap of humanity. At first, he thought she was dead. Her face was a shocking tapestry of purple and blue bruises, her lips split and swollen. One eye was puffed completely shut. Her dress was torn, her hands raw and bleeding, and she was shivering so violently it seemed her very bones were rattling apart. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the deep snow, and knelt beside her. When his gloved hand touched her shoulder, a faint, ragged moan escaped her lips. Alive. He felt a surge of irritation, sharp and unwelcome. This was a complication he did not need. This was a problem, another mouth to feed, another life to potentially be responsible for. His first instinct was to ride on, to leave her to the fate that had so clearly found her. The West was littered with the bones of those who weren't strong enough, and sentiment was a luxury he could not afford. He stood up, turning back toward his horse. But then he looked down at her again, at the way the snow was beginning to cover her like a shroud. He saw the faint puff of her breath, a tiny, fleeting cloud in the frigid air. He remembered lying in a field hospital, the stench of death thick around him, praying for someone, anyone, to stop and offer a drink of water. He cursed under his breath, a low, guttural sound lost in the wind. Duty, or some long-buried shard of decency, one out. With a grunt of effort, he scooped her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of rags and bones. He draped her over the front of his saddle, mounted behind her, and urged Abraham toward the distant plume of smoke that marked his cabin. He didn't ask her name or what had happened. The story was written on her face. She was a woman alone. And in this country, that was an invitation for the worst kind of trouble. He could see the tracks of 2 horses leading away from the rocks, heading east. Robbers, most likely. They'd taken what they wanted and left her for the wolves and the cold. He didn't take her into the cabin. That was his space, his sanctuary of solitude. Instead, he carried her into the barn. The air inside was thick with the scent of hay and horse, a smell far more comforting to him than any perfume. He laid her gently on a pile of clean hay in an empty stall, the one that used to belong to his father's prized stallion. He covered her with 3 heavy wool horse blankets, then went to the cabin to fetch a bucket of snow to melt for water. When he returned, she was stirring, her one good eye fluttering open. It was a deep, dark brown, and in it, he saw a terror so profound it momentarily stunned him. She flinched as he approached, trying to scramble away. "Stay still," he commanded, his voice rough from disuse. "You're safe here." The word safe felt foreign on his tongue. He wasn't sure such a place existed. He cleaned her wounds with a rag and lukewarm water, his movements practiced and impersonal. He'd tended to enough injuries on the battlefield to know what he was doing. She didn't cry out, though he saw her clench her jaw, her knuckles white where she gripped the blanket. She watched him with that one wary eye, tracking his every move like a cornered animal. When he was done, he left her a tin cup of water and a piece of hardtack. "My name is Maribel," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He just grunted in acknowledgement and left, closing the heavy barn door behind him, shutting out the woman and the trouble she represented. He had given her shelter for the night, a temporary reprieve from the storm. In the morning, he told himself, she would have to go. He couldn't take her in, he couldn't. But the morning brought a world buried in white. The blizzard had raged all night, piling snow into drifts as high as a man's head. The territory was impassable. She was trapped here, and so, by extension, was he. Maribel did not beg or plead her case. She proved her worth through work. On the second day, Eli found that she had swept the barn floor clean, organized his tools on the workbench, and used his spare axe to chop a neat pile of kindling from a fallen pine limb. Her movements were slow, pained, but deliberate. She was a woman who understood that survival was earned, not given. Eli maintained his distance. He would leave a plate of food on a crate just inside the barn door, and when he returned later, the plate would be empty and there would be a fresh bucket of water drawn from the well, or a stack of mended burlap sacks. It was a silent, transactional relationship. He provided food and shelter. She provided labor. No words were needed. The winter deepened. Weeks bled into a month, then 2. The snow never seemed to stop falling, and the cold was a relentless siege. The barn, for all its shelter, was a frigid tomb. Eli knew she couldn't survive the whole winter out there. The thought annoyed him, gnawing at the edges of his solitude. One evening, as the temperature plummeted and he could see his own breath inside the cabin, he finally relented. He strode to the barn and threw open the door. "Get your things," he said, not looking at her. "You can sleep by the stove. It's too cold out here." Maribel simply nodded, gathered her single wool blanket, and followed him to the cabin without a word of thanks. The thanks was in her eyes, a flicker of something that looked like relief, but he refused to meet her gaze. Her presence changed the very air in the small cabin. The space, once entirely his, now had to be shared. He gave her a pallet of blankets on the floor in the corner farthest from his cot, a pitiful attempt at creating distance in a room no bigger than a horse stall. But there was no escaping her. He was constantly aware of the soft rustle of her movements, the scent of wood smoke and something faintly female that clung to her, the quiet sound of her breathing in the dead of night. They rarely spoke. Their days were a shared routine of survival. He would hunt and chop wood. She would cook, mend his worn-out clothes with thread she'd unraveled from a sack, and keep the fire fed. She was a phantom in his home, quiet and efficient. She never complained. The bruises on her face slowly faded from a violent purple to a sickly yellow-green, and then disappeared altogether, leaving behind a faint, silvery scar by her temple. She was not a beautiful woman in the conventional sense. Her face was too thin, her features too sharp, etched with a sorrow that seemed permanent. But her hands were capable, her back was strong, and her eyes held a depth that he found both unnerving and compelling. They were two solitary souls trapped in a cage of winter, circling each other with a wary caution. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was charged, filled with unspoken questions and a tension that hummed just beneath the surface. He would catch her watching him sometimes, her dark eyes filled with an unreadable expression, and he would quickly look away, his heart giving a strange, unfamiliar lurch. He was a man who prided himself on control, but his control was fraying. At night, he would lie awake on his cot, staring at the rough-hewn timbers of the ceiling, intensely aware of her sleeping just a few feet away. The thin wooden wall separating his cot from the main room felt as flimsy as paper. He could feel her warmth, imagine the gentle rise and fall of her chest. It had been years since he'd been this close to a woman. The war had burned away such softness, such needs, or so he had thought. Now, this quiet widow was stoking embers he thought had long turned to ash. The feeling was terrifying. It was a weakness, a chink in his armor, and he fought it with a grim determination, retreating further into his gruff silence. The storm that changed everything came in late February. It was a monster of a storm, a squall of thunder and ice that rattled the very foundations of the cabin. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and frozen rain hammered against the single glass window pane. Eli had been out all day trying to round up a stray calf, and he'd returned soaked to the bone, chilled in a way that felt deep and permanent. By nightfall, the fever had taken hold. It started as a shiver he couldn't control, and quickly escalated into a raging fire that consumed him from the inside out. His teeth chattered, his skin was slick with sweat, and his mind began to drift, lost in a fog of pain and disjointed memories of battlefields and frozen trenches. He was vaguely aware of Maribel. She was a steady presence in the swirling chaos of his fever dream. He felt her cool hand on his forehead, a shocking comfort against his burning skin. She pressed a cup of hot, bitter tea to his lips, and he drank, the herbal liquid scalding a path down his throat. At some point, the storm in his mind became one with the storm outside. He was thrashing on his cot, caught in a nightmare of fire and noise. He cried out, a raw, wounded sound. Through the haze, he heard her soft voice. "Hush now, Eli, hush!" He felt her unbuttoning his damp shirt. The cool air on his chest was a relief. Then he felt something else, a warm, damp cloth, and the gentle pressure of her hands as she spread a pungent poultice of herbs across his chest. The smell of mustard and yarrow filled his senses, sharp and grounding. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, the fever fog cleared. She was leaning over him, her face illuminated by the flickering firelight. Her hair had come loose from its severe bun, and soft tendrils framed her face. Her expression was one of intense concentration, her brow furrowed with concern. The professional distance was gone. The silent house guest was gone. In her place was a woman, caring for a man. Their eyes met. In that single, sustained glance, the unspoken tension of the past months coalesced and arced between them like lightning. He saw not a widow, not a burden, but Maribel. He saw her strength, her quiet endurance, the deep well of sadness behind her eyes, and something else, a flicker of warmth, of a shared loneliness that mirrored his own. She saw not the hardened, silent rancher, but Eli, a man laid low, vulnerable, his defenses stripped away by fever, the pain he kept so carefully hidden now stark and visible in his eyes. Neither of them moved. The world seemed to shrink to the small space between their faces. The roar of the storm outside faded to a dull hum. He could feel her breath on his skin, warm and sweet. He didn't know who moved first. Perhaps neither of them did. Perhaps the space between them simply collapsed under the weight of all that had gone unsaid. Their lips met. It wasn't a kiss of passion or romance. It was something more primal, more desperate. It was a shock of warmth in a world of cold, a moment of contact in a lifetime of isolation. It was clumsy and brief, a hesitant press of mouth against mouth, and it was over as quickly as it began. They pulled back at the same instant, their eyes wide, a look of shared shock on their faces. The spell was broken. Maribel straightened up abruptly, her hands fluttering to her sides. Eli stared at her, his mind suddenly, painfully clear. A flush crept up her neck, and she turned away, busying herself with tidying the herbs.
"The fever,"
she stammered, not looking at him.
"You should rest."
He didn't answer. He couldn't. He closed his eyes, and the last thing he saw was her retreating back as she moved to her pallet on the other side of the wall. They both lay awake for the rest of the night, separated by a few feet of wood and a chasm of regret, each pretending the other was asleep, each pretending it had never happened. In the dark, Maribel clutched her blanket, her heart hammering against her ribs. That kiss had undone her. It had cracked the careful shell she had built around her own broken pieces. She was a woman with a secret, a past so dark and shameful she had never spoken of it to a living soul. She had been sold, not married, to a brute of a man whose fists were his only language. He had used her body until it was bruised and broken, and in that crucible of pain, a child had been conceived, a tiny, flickering hope in an endless night. But her husband had sneered at her swelling belly, calling the child a bastard, and when her time came, he had summoned the town's midwife, a cruel, slatternly woman with whiskey on her breath and malice in her heart. The woman's hands had been rough, her methods brutal. The baby, a girl, had been born blue and still. Maribel had held her for only a moment before the midwife snatched her away, wrapping her in a rag and tossing her aside like so much refuse. The memory was a wound that would not heal, a constant, silent scream in her soul. She was soiled, ruined, a woman whose touch brought only death and despair. She had no right to feel the warmth that had bloomed in her chest when Eli's lips touched hers. No right at all. Eli, too, was tormented. The fever broke the next morning, but a new kind of sickness had taken its place. The memory of the kiss, the feel of her skin, the look in her eyes, it haunted him. He had allowed a crack in his wall, and now the loneliness he had kept at bay for so long was flooding in, bringing with it a dangerous, treacherous companion, desire. He wanted her. The admission, even to himself, was a betrayal of every vow he'd made to his own hardened heart. This life, this strange, silent dance with the widow in his cabin, was untenable. It was a murky, ambiguous hell. He needed something clear, something defined. A wife, a family. Not for love. He no longer believed in such a thing, but for structure, for a sense of purpose. A wife would cook and clean and bear him sons to inherit the ranch. It would be a contract, a transaction, clean and simple. A proper wife, untouched and pure. A woman from the East who understood her duties and wouldn't come with the ghosts he saw in Maribel's eyes. A virgin bride. She would be the wall he could build between himself and the unsettling feelings the widow stirred in him. That afternoon, while Maribel was outside feeding the chickens, Eli sat at his small, crude table. He took out a sheet of paper, a bottle of ink, and a pen. His hand, calloused and scarred, felt clumsy as it formed the letters. He wrote to a mail-order bride agency in St. Louis, his words stark and practical. To whom it may concern. I am a rancher, age 32, sober and hard-working. I own my land. I seek a wife, a woman of good character, plain and strong, willing to work and bear children. I am a man of simple needs. Send a photograph if possible. Sincerely, Eli Quinn, Quinn Ranch, Wyoming Territory. He folded the letter, sealed it with a drop of wax, and set it on the mantelpiece. It felt like a stone on his chest. He had made his choice. He had chosen order over chaos, duty over desire, a clean future over a complicated present. He looked out the window at Maribel, who was breaking the ice in the water trough, her movement strong and sure. A bitter, aching regret lodged itself in his throat. The letter would go out with the first thaw, and with it, he hoped, would go the ghost of a kiss that had promised a warmth he was too afraid to accept. Annabeth arriving in Wyoming was like a porcelain teacup being set down in a blacksmith's shop. She was 19, a product of Boston's brick-lined streets, quiet libraries, and the prim, structured grief that followed her father's passing. His death had left her an orphan, with little inheritance beyond a good name and an education in poetry and watercolors, currencies with no value on the frontier. The advertisement for a mail-order bride had seemed like a lifeline, a respectable escape from a future as a governess or a poor relation. Eli Quinn's letter, with its stark, honest words, had promised not romance, but stability. He was a landowner. He was sober. He sought a woman of good character in her naivete. Annabeth had colored in the spaces between his words with her own ideals, painting a portrait of a stoic, hard-working man who simply needed a woman's gentle touch to build a home and a family. The journey west was a systematic dismantling of those ideals. The train ride was the first shock, a clattering, soot-stained ordeal that carried her away from everything familiar. But it was the stagecoach from Cheyenne that truly terrified her. It was a bone-jarring, suffocating box that smelled of unwashed bodies and cheap whiskey. Hurtling through a landscape so vast and empty, it seemed like the world God had forgotten to finish. The land was not green and gentle like the pastures of New England. It was a brutal expanse of red dirt, sharp-edged mountains that scraped at the sky, and a relentless wind that howled like a hungry wolf, carrying with it the grit that got into her eyes, her mouth, her very soul. By the time the stagecoach lurched to a halt in the dusty collection of wooden shacks they called a town, she was trembling, her fine Boston dress coated in a film of grime, her spirit frayed. And there he was, Eli Quinn. He was taller than she'd imagined, broad-shouldered and lean, but it was his face that arrested her. His features were handsome in a severe, sun-beaten way, but his eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they held a deep, settled weariness that went far beyond physical exhaustion. He was not the blank canvas she had imagined. This was a man who had already been written upon, and the story was a grim one. He looked at her not with the hopeful anticipation of a groom, but with the flat, assessing gaze of a man taking stock of a new piece of livestock. Standing just a step behind him was another woman. She was older, perhaps in her 30s, with a thin, angular face and dark, watchful eyes. She was dressed in a simple, faded calico dress, and her hands, though clean, were chapped and raw from work. There was nothing remarkable about her. Yet Annabeth felt a strange, unnerving prickle on her skin. It was in the way the woman stood near Eli, not touching, but occupying the same space with an ease that spoke of long familiarity. "Miss Worthington," Eli said, his voice a low rumble. He tipped his hat, a gesture that seemed more habit than courtesy. "I'm Eli Quinn." "Mr. Quinn," Annabeth managed, her voice a small, tight thing. "It is a pleasure." Eli's gaze flickered for a fraction of a second to the woman beside him. "This is Maribel. She helps around the ranch." Maribel's eyes met Annabeth's. There was no warmth in them, but no hostility either. It was a look of profound, soul-deep resignation, as if she were witnessing an event she had long foreseen and was powerless to stop. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Annabeth felt a confusing knot of emotions, pity for the woman's plainness, and a strange, baseless unease. She was the bride, the future Mrs. Quinn. This other woman was just a helper, yet, in that moment, Annabeth felt like the intruder. The ride to the ranch in Eli's wagon was conducted in a silence broken only by the creak of the wheels and the sigh of the wind. Eli seemed to have exhausted his capacity for conversation with his initial greeting. Maribel sat beside him on the wagon bench, while Annabeth was perched in the back with her trunks, feeling like a piece of cargo. She watched the way Eli handled the reins, his movements sure and economical. She saw how Maribel, without a word, handed him a canteen when he squinted against the sun. It was a small, seamless gesture, an action born of 1,000 shared days. It was the first of many such moments that would begin to chip away at Annabeth's carefully constructed fantasy. The cabin was smaller and rougher than she had imagined. It was clean, meticulously so, but stark. A stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a cot in the corner. There was no softness, no comfort. It was a place for survival, not living. A new, larger bed had been built against the far wall, clearly for the married couple. The sight of it made Annabeth's stomach clench with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "Maribel will show you where things are," Eli said, already turning to leave. "I've got to see to the horses." He disappeared out the door, leaving the 2 women alone in the charged silence. Maribel moved with a quiet efficiency that made Annabeth feel clumsy and ornamental. She pointed to the pantry, the well outside, the wood pile. Her explanations were brief and practical. The stove draws best when the damper is halfway. The well water is sweet but needs to be boiled. The nights get cold. Where do you sleep?" Annabeth asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Maribel's hand stilled for a moment where she was stacking tins of beans. "In the barn," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "It suits me." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Annabeth felt a fresh wave of unease. The woman who knew the secrets of the stove and the well water slept with the animals. The first weeks were a lonely, bewildering education. Annabeth tried to impose her sense of order on the cabin, to make it a home. She unpacked the lace doilies her mother had made and placed them on the rough wooden table, where they looked absurd and fragile. She tried to cook the refined dishes she had learned in Boston, but her ingredients were limited to flour, salt pork, and beans, and her efforts were often bland or burned. Eli remained a remote and silent presence. He was not unkind. He was simply absent. He ate the food she prepared without comment, his eyes fixed on his plate. He answered her questions with single words. He never touched her. He would rise before dawn and work until long after dusk. And when he came inside, he would bring the cold of the outdoors with him, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He would sit by the fire for a spell, cleaning his rifle or mending a piece of tack, his silence a wall she could not penetrate. At night, he slept on his old cot, claiming he was not yet used to the new bed, leaving her to lie alone in the large, cold space, her heart aching with a loneliness more profound than any she had ever known. She began to suspect the terrible truth. She was not a wife to him. She was a solution, a contract. He had purchased her, a woman of good character, to fill a role, to warm his bed and bear his children. Love was not part of the transaction. The realization was a cold, hard stone in her gut. She was a brood mare, chosen for her purity and her perceived strength and her heart, with all its foolish, romantic notions, was an irrelevant accessory. And then there was Maribel, after Annabeth's arrival. The widow had tried to make herself scarce, a shadow retreating to the edges of the homestead, but her presence was indelible. It was in the perfectly stacked firewood that appeared on the porch each morning, the subtly repaired tear in Eli's shirt, the way the chickens were always fed and the single milk cow always tended before Annabeth even thought of it. Maribel was trying to remove herself from the cabin, but she could not remove herself from the rhythm of the ranch, a rhythm she and Eli had established together over 2 long winters. Annabeth would watch her from the cabin window, this silent, capable woman who moved with the land as if she had sprung from it. She saw strength in Maribel, but also a deep, abiding sadness. She tried to feel a wife's jealousy, a righteous indignation, but all she could muster was a confusing mix of resentment and a strange, unwanted empathy. She was beginning to understand that Maribel was not her rival. They were both just women, caught in the orbit of a man who was a black hole of grief, pulling everything into his silence. The moment of painful clarity came one morning just before dawn. The air was crisp and cold, and a low mist clung to the ground. Annabeth had woken early, unable to sleep. She looked out the window toward the barn and saw Eli, already awake, leaning against a fence post, a tin cup of coffee in his hand. He wasn't looking at the mountains or the cattle. He was looking toward the cabin's porch. Maribel was there, kneeling before the outdoor fire pit, coaxing a small flame to life. The firelight cast a warm, golden glow on her face, softening its harsh angles, making her look younger, almost peaceful. She was focused on her task, her movements unhurried and sure, and Eli watched her. It was the look on his face that broke something inside Annabeth. All the walls he kept around her, all the stony indifference, had crumbled in his gaze. As he watched the widow build a simple fire, was a universe of unspoken emotion. There was a raw, unguarded longing. There was a profound, aching regret. There was the weary tenderness of a man looking at the one thing in his desolate world that made any sense. It was the look a husband gives his wife, a look of shared history, of secrets kept, of a bond forged in fire and ice. It was everything he had never, not for a single second, given to Annabeth. A sharp, physical pain shot through her chest, so intense it made her gasp for breath. In that instant, she knew. She was the outsider. She was the ghost at their table. The life she had imagined, the home she had hoped to build, was a lie. It had already been built, and its hearth was tended by another woman. That night, by the wavering light of a single candle, Annabeth wrote a letter to her aunt in Boston. Her tears fell onto the cheap paper, smudging the ink. Dearest Aunt Carol, I have made a terrible mistake. The West is not what I imagined, and Mr. Quinn is not the man I believed him to be. This place is hard and lonely, and my heart is broken. I am not wanted here. I wish to come home, please, if you have any funds to spare. Send what you can for my passage. She folded the letter, her hands trembling. She would give it to the post rider on his next pass. She would go home. She would face the humiliation, the life of a spinster, anything to escape this suffocating silence and the pain of seeing that look on his face again. She tucked the letter into her book of poetry and cried herself into a fitful sleep. But in the morning, something had shifted. As she packed her few belongings into her trunk, her movements were slow, hesitant. She caught her reflection in the small, cracked mirror by the door. She saw a pale, frightened girl, ready to run at the first sign of hardship. Her father's face flashed in her mind, a stern, proud man who had never backed down from a challenge in his life. He had taught her that a Worthington did not retreat. A spark of defiance, small but fierce, ignited in her chest. Who was this Maribel? A plain, sad widow who slept in a barn. And who was she? Annabeth Worthington, soon to be Annabeth Quinn. She was the wife, the clean, respectable, virgin bride he had sent for. This ranch, this man, this future, they were hers by contract, by law, and by God, she had made a bargain, and she would not be the one to break it. She would not run. She would stay. She would fight. She would make Eli see her, make him love her. She would win. She took the letter from her book and, with a firm, resolute hand, tore it into tiny pieces, letting them fall like snowflakes into the cold firebox of the stove. That evening, she wore her best dress, a simple blue muslin, and brushed her blonde hair until it shone in the firelight. She made a stew that was, for once, savory and thick. She set the table with the 2 good plates she had brought from Boston. She was going to be a wife to him. Eli came in, tired and grim as always. He washed his face and hands in the basin, his movements brusque. He sat at the table and ate, his silence as heavy as a shroud. Annabeth's resolve began to waver. Later, as the fire burned low, she stood by the new bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was her duty. This was how she would claim her place.
Eli,
She said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up from his cot, his expression unreadable.
it is time,
She said, her cheeks burning.
for us to be man and wife.
A flicker of something, was it surprise, panic, crossed his face. He stood up slowly. He was so tall, so imposing in the small room. He walked toward her, and the space between them crackled with a terrifying, awkward energy. This was not the tender, loving moment she had read about in her books. This was a grim transaction, and she was terrified. He reached for her, his large, calloused hands settling on her shoulders. He smelled of pine, sweat, and the cold night air. He leaned in to kiss her, but his movements were stiff, hesitant. She could feel the conflict in him, the complete absence of genuine affection. It felt like a violation, a duty being performed, when his lips, chapped and hard, touched hers. A wave of panic washed over her. It was all wrong. This wasn't love. It wasn't even kindness.
No,
She gasped, turning her head away.
please, I can't.
She pushed against his chest, her strength surprising both of them. Eli recoiled as if he'd been struck. The frustration and shame on his face were plain to see. Without a single word, he turned, grabbed a blanket from his cot, and stalked out of the cabin, slamming the door behind him. Annabeth collapsed onto the bed, sobbing, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. She had tried to be a wife, and she had failed. She had pushed him away, pushed him right out the door and into the night. Eli went to the barn. It was his only refuge. He threw the blanket into the empty stall where he had first laid Maribel. The memory a fresh torment. He was a failure. He had failed the men he led in the war. He had failed to protect his heart. And now he had failed the young, innocent woman he had brought into this mess. He had tried to do the right thing, the clean thing, and it had blown up in his face. He sank down into the hay, burying his face in his hands, the picture of defeat. A few minutes later, the barn door creaked open. A sliver of lantern light cut through the darkness. It was Maribel. She stood in the doorway, holding a heavier wool blanket, her silhouette framed by the light. She didn't speak. She walked over and simply held the blanket out to him. He looked up at her, his face a mask of misery. She was the source of his torment and his only comfort. Her dark eyes held no judgment, only a deep, knowing sorrow. She understood his silence, his pain, in a way Annabeth never could. He didn't take the blanket. She hesitated, then bent to place it over his shoulders. As she turned to leave, her hand brushed against his. In that instant, something inside him snapped. The control he had clung to for years, the wall he had built stone by painful stone, shattered. He grabbed her hand. His grip wasn't rough, but it was desperate. A drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. She froze, looking down at his large hand, completely enveloping hers. He didn't let go. He held on as if he were afraid she would dissolve into the darkness. She started to turn back toward him, a question in her eyes. And he finally spoke, his voice a raw, broken whisper, uttering the one word that held all his confusion, his longing, and his damnation. Maribel. To say Eli's name was to unravel her. The single word, spoken in that raw, broken whisper, stripped away 2 years of Maribel's carefully constructed defenses. For 2 years, she had been a ghost, a helper, a silent presence. She had folded his clothes, cooked his meals, and slept just feet away from him, all while pretending the chasm between them was impassable. But his hand around hers was a bridge, and his voice was a summons she was powerless to ignore. She stood frozen in the lantern light, the heavy wool blanket still clutched in her free hand. She should have pulled away. The wife, the real wife, was in the cabin, weeping because of this very man. Guilt, sharp and cold, pierced through her. She was a trespasser, a shadow lingering where she no longer belonged. Annabeth, with her soft hands and unlined face, was the future. Maribel was the past, a relic of a shared survival that was supposed to be over. But his grip was desperate. It was the grip of a man who had spent years drowning in silence and had finally broken the surface for a gasp of air. In his eyes, she saw the same desolation that lived in her own soul. He wasn't looking at a widow or a servant. He was looking at her, the woman who had seen him through a fever, who understood the language of his silences, who knew the precise weight of the loneliness that bent his shoulders. Slowly, she relaxed her hand in his. She did not pull away. She did not speak. She simply stood there, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a treaty signed in the cold, hay-scented air of the barn. He finally let go, a shudder racking his frame, and turned away, sinking back into the hay. Maribel placed the blanket gently over his shoulders and retreated, her heart a wild, frantic drum against her ribs. She had not pulled away. That was her betrayal, and it was just the beginning. The days that followed were a torment of unspoken things. The three of them moved through the routines of the ranch like actors in a poorly rehearsed play. Annabeth was brittle and quiet, her eyes often red-rimmed. Her attempts at housewifely duties performed with a tight-lipped precision that felt more like an accusation than an effort. Eli was a thundercloud of a man, his silence even more profound, his movements heavy with a guilt that seemed to weigh him down like a physical yoke. He avoided looking at either of them. Maribel felt as if she were walking on glass. Every interaction was fraught with peril. A simple request from Eli for more coffee, a shared glance with Annabeth over the mending basket. Each was a potential spark in a room filled with black powder. She was consumed by a guilt so profound it soured the food in her mouth. She was the interloper, the reason for the young bride's misery. She tried to make herself smaller, to become invisible, but her very existence was a reproach. Yet, underneath the guilt, a treacherous seed of hope had taken root. He had said her name. He had reached for her. The hope was a terrible, beautiful poison, and she hated herself for it. The storm came at the end of the week, as if the heavens themselves could no longer tolerate the pressure building on the small, isolated ranch. It wasn't a clean, honest blizzard of snow. It was a vicious late-winter tantrum of sleet and thunder that turned the world to a gray, roaring chaos. The wind clawed at the cabin, and the thunder was a constant, percussive barrage that seemed to shake the very logs in the walls. They ate their supper in near total silence, the storm providing the only conversation. Annabeth picked at her food, her face pale in the lantern light. Eli stared into the fire, his jaw set. After the meal, Annabeth retreated to the bedroom, closing the door with a soft but definitive click. Eli remained by the fire, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The rhythmic lick of steel on stone, a grating counterpoint to the storm's roar. Maribel knew she should go to the barn. It was where she belonged. But the thought of the cold, the roaring wind, and the lonely darkness was unbearable tonight. She busied herself, washing the tin plates, her back to Eli. The air between them was thick with everything they had held back for 2 years. A particularly violent crack of thunder, so close it felt as if the sky had split open directly overhead, made her jump, a small cry escaping her lips. The plate she was holding slipped from her numb fingers and clattered to the floor.
Leave it!
Eli's voice was rough, but it wasn't angry. She knelt to pick up the plate, her hands trembling. When she stood up, he was there, standing right behind her. He hadn't made a sound. She was trapped between him and the wash basin. "Maribel," he said again. And this time her name was not a question but a statement, a surrender. He raised a hand and gently, so gently it was almost agonizing, tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers, calloused and rough, grazed the skin of her cheek. It was the first time he had touched her with anything approaching tenderness. A sob caught in her throat. The fight went out of her. The guilt, the shame, the years of telling herself she deserved nothing. It all dissolved under the simple, devastating weight of his touch. He didn't kiss her. He simply rested his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. "I can't," he breathed, the words a confession against her skin. "I can't do this anymore." She knew what he meant. The pretending, the distance, the lie they were all trying to live. In that moment, he wasn't Annabeth's husband and she wasn't the widow who worked on his ranch. They were just two people who had survived a long, hard winter together, and who could no longer bear the cold. He took her hand and led her not to the bed where his new wife lay, but out into the screaming storm. The wind and ice tore at them, but they barely felt it. He led her to the barn. Inside, the roar of the storm was muted to a distant fury. The air was warm and alive with the smell of animals and hay. He lit a single lantern, casting long, dancing shadows. There, in the golden gloom, they finally came together. It was not a gentle union. It was a desperate, frantic collision of two people starved for contact, for warmth, for a moment of obliteration. It was a release of 2 years of pent-up loneliness, of unspoken desire, of a shared grief that had no other outlet. His hands were in her hair, on her back, pulling her close as if he meant to absorb her into himself, her arms wrapped around his neck, clinging to him as the anchor in her storm-tossed world. Their kisses were hungry, bruising, a conversation of pure, unvarnished need. They shed their clothes and their solitude, falling together into the clean, soft hay of the empty stall. It was a place of desperation and solace, a sanctuary where, for a few stolen hours, there was no past and no future, only the overwhelming truth of the present. In the cabin, Annabeth was awoken by the sound of the front door slamming shut against the wind. The thunder had startled her from a fitful sleep, and her heart was pounding. She lay in the dark, listening. The cabin was unnervingly quiet. Eli's cot was just on the other side of her bedroom door. She should have been able to hear him breathing, or the sound of him shifting in his sleep, but there was nothing, only the howl of the wind. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, snaked around her heart. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet cold on the rough floorboards. She pulled on her wrapper, her hands shaking, and eased open the bedroom door. The main room was empty. Eli's cot was empty, the blanket thrown aside. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint, demonic red light on the vacant space. He was gone. Maribel's pallet was also empty. They were both gone.
"Eli!"
She called out, her voice a thin, reedy thing that was swallowed by the storm. Panic seized her. She grabbed the lantern from the table, her fingers fumbling with the flint and steel until a weak flame sputtered to life. Shielding it with her hand, she pulled open the cabin door and stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind nearly tore the lantern from her grasp, and the ice bit at her face and bare feet. Her first thought was the horses. The storm must have spooked them. He had gone to the barn, of course, and Maribel, ever the helper, must have gone with him. The explanation was logical. but it did nothing to quell the frantic terror clawing at her insides. She stumbled through the mud and sleet toward the barn, the lantern light a small, swimming circle in the vast, roaring darkness. The big barn door was closed, but not latched. A thin sliver of warmer light seeped from beneath it. She pushed it open. The scene that met her eyes would be burned into her memory forever. There, in the back stall, illuminated by the soft glow of a second lantern, they were tangled together in the hay, their bodies entwined, his dark head buried in the curve of her neck. It was a tableau of shocking, undeniable intimacy. It was not a violent act or a sordid fumble in the dark. It was something far worse. It was tender. It was profound. It was the physical expression of the look she had seen on his face that morning by the fire pit. It was love. A sound tore from Annabeth's throat, a sound she didn't recognize as her own. It was a raw, primal scream of a creature that has been mortally wounded. Eli's head shot up, his eyes, wide with shock and horror, met hers across the length of the barn. Maribel scrambled to cover herself, her face a mask of utter shame. But Annabeth didn't see them anymore. She saw only the wreckage of her life. She dropped the lantern, plunging the barn back into near darkness, and she turned and fled. She ran blindly back through the storm, not to the cabin, but out into the open prairie, her screams lost in the indifferent howl of the wind. The morning dawned quiet and clean. The world washed new by the storm. The sky was a pale, fragile blue, and the air was cold and sharp. Annabeth eventually found her way back to the cabin, soaked, shivering, and hollowed out. She collapsed into her bed and fell into a state that was neither sleep nor waking. Eli found her there. He didn't come to her room. He stood in the doorway, his face haggard, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. When she finally looked at him, he did not offer excuses. He did not blame the storm or the whiskey he hadn't drunk. He simply knelt on the floor outside her room. It was not a gesture of supplication, but one of profound, honest sorrow. "Annabeth," he said, his voice thick with gravel and grief. "I'm sorry. There is no excuse for what I have done. I have dishonored you, and I am sorry." He said nothing more. He stayed there, kneeling, for a long time before he finally rose and went outside to begin the day's chores, his movements slow and heavy. Maribel had gathered her few belongings, a spare dress, a brush, a small wooden bird her father had carved for her, into a bundle. Her face was ashen, her eyes empty. She was going to walk away, disappear back into the wilderness from which she had come. It was the only honorable thing to do. She had destroyed this girl's life, had taken the one thing that was not hers to take. She was at the edge of the property when Annabeth appeared, her hair wild, her eyes blazing with a fire Maribel had never seen before. "Where do you think you're going?" Annabeth's voice was low and trembling with rage.
I'm leaving,
Maribel said quietly.
It's for the best.
"The best for whom?" Annabeth spat. "So you can run away and leave me here to clean up your mess, so you can play the martyr?" She stalked forward until she was standing directly in front of Maribel. And then she did something that shocked them both. She drew back her hand and slapped Maribel across the face. The sound was a sharp crack in the clean morning air. Maribel's head snapped to the side, a red mark blooming on her cheek. She did not flinch. She did not retaliate. She simply stood there and took it, her dark eyes filled with a bottomless well of acceptance. The act of violence seemed to break something in Annabeth. The rage drained out of her, replaced by a great, shuddering wave of grief. Her face crumpled. A terrible, wrenching sob escaped her, and she fell forward, collapsing against the woman she hated most in the world. She buried her face in Maribel's shoulder and wept, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. For a long moment, Maribel remained rigid with shock. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she raised her arms and wrapped them around the weeping girl. She held Annabeth, patting her back with a gentle, rhythmic motion. murmuring soft, meaningless words of comfort, just as she might have soothed a frightened animal. And there they stood, the wife and the widow, clinging to each other in the wreckage of their lives. Annabeth did not leave, and she did not let Maribel leave. The days that followed were raw and painful, but the suffocating silence was gone, replaced by a fragile, terrifying honesty. That evening, as Eli sat outside, giving them space, Annabeth sat at the table opposite Maribel. "I don't understand," Annabeth said, her voice hoarse from crying. "I need you to make me understand." "Understand what?" Maribel asked softly. "Him, you, why?" Annabeth's gaze was unflinching. "Why would a man like Eli, a man who owns his own land, who sent for a proper wife, why would he choose you? You're not new. You are not young. You are not a virgin." The words were cruel, but they were spoken with a genuine, desperate confusion, not malice. She was trying to make sense of a world that no longer fit the rules she had been taught. Maribel looked down at her work-worn hands. She had two choices. She could stay silent, or she could tell the truth. She looked at the girl across from her, a girl whose life she had ruined, and she knew she owed her the truth, all of it. "He did not choose me over you, Annabeth," she began, her voice low and steady. "What is between Eli and me? It was forged long before you came. It was forged in a winter so cold it felt like the world was ending. It was forged in silence and sickness and survival." And then she told her everything. She told her about being sold to a man named Jedediah, a man whose kindness was a lie that lasted only until the preacher had left. She spoke of his fists, of the fear, of feeling like a piece of property. And then she told Annabeth the secret she had never even told Eli. "I was with child," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Jedediah. He was not pleased. He said it wasn't his, though it could be no other's. When my time came, he brought a woman from the town, a midwife. She was drunk. Her hands were unclean." Maribel's voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "It was a girl. She was so small. She did not breathe. The woman took her from me. She said I was a cursed thing, and that my child was born of sin." Tears streamed down Maribel's face, silent and hot. "I buried her myself, wrapped in a piece of my own dress, under a small aspen tree. A week later, Jedediah was killed in a saloon brawl. I was a widow. I had nothing, so I started walking." Annabeth stared at her, her eyes wide with a horror that transcended jealousy. The neat categories of her world, wife and mistress, virgin and whore, good and bad, were dissolving into meaningless dust. This woman was not a seductress. She was a survivor. She was a mother who had lost her child. She was a woman who had been brutalized and discarded by the world, and who had somehow found the strength to keep breathing. The hatred in Annabeth's heart was gone. In its place was a vast, aching emptiness. Her heart was broken, not just by Eli's betrayal, but by the cruel, unjust nature of the world Maribel had shown her. She understood now. Eli had not fallen for a widow. He had fallen for a woman whose strength matched the harshness of the land itself. He had found a partner not in her own naive purity, but in Maribel's profound, hard-won resilience. She, Annabeth, had offered him her innocence. Maribel had offered him her soul. There was no contest. That night, Annabeth went to Eli. He was sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the stars, a solitary figure in the immense darkness. She sat down beside him, not touching. "She told me," Annabeth said quietly, "about her husband, about the baby." Eli flinched as if she had struck him. He had known Maribel was a widow, had suspected her life had been hard, but he had never known the depths of it. He had never dared to ask. Annabeth looked at him, her eyes clear and filled with a new, painful understanding. "I understand why you love her. She said it was not an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. A profound, sorrowful silence settled between them. "I don't want to leave," Annabeth said finally, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. "This is my home now. You are my husband." She turned to face him, her gaze direct and unwavering. Her innocence was gone, burned away in the fires of the last 24 hours. In its place was something harder, something more real. "I am your wife," she repeated, "but I do not know how to be one, not the kind of wife a man like you needs." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I want you to teach me," she said. "I want you to teach me everything. Teach me like a real husband. Teach me the way she taught you." Annabeth's request hung in the cold night air, a dare that was also a plea. To his credit, Eli did not flinch from it. He saw the raw determination in his young wife's eyes, the desperate need to bridge the chasm between them, and he recognized it as a courage that matched his own stubbornness. A great, weary weight of responsibility settled upon him. He had broken this girl's heart and shattered her innocence. The least he could do was honor her strange, painful request. And so began their lessons. Their nights together in the large, new bed were not a continuation of the disaster that had driven him to the barn. They were something else entirely. A slow, painstaking construction of a new language. The first night, he was so gentle he was almost hesitant, as if he were handling a spooked foal. His touch was a question, not a demand. He showed her how a kiss could be soft, a caress could be comforting, how the weight of a man's body did not have to be a threat. For Annabeth, it was a terrifying and revelatory education. She had braced herself for an ordeal, a duty to be endured. Instead, she found a quiet, solemn tenderness. Eli's movements were patient. His hands, though rough with calluses, were careful on her skin. It was clumsy. It was awkward. There were moments of profound, uncertain silence, but it was also deeply, achingly sincere. He was trying, with every fiber of his being, to be the husband she had asked for, and in those fumbling, gentle nights, as she learned the rhythms of a shared bed, a fragile shoot of affection for this broken, trying man began to grow in the ruins of her heart. She was his wife. This was how a marriage was built, she told herself, slowly, deliberately. But as the weeks turned into a month, a subtle poison began to seep into their fragile intimacy. The tenderness that had at first felt like a gift began to feel rehearsed. Annabeth started to notice a pattern in his gentleness, the way he would brush the hair from her temple, the specific, soft way he would whisper her name in the dark, the rhythm of his touch. It all felt too perfect, too practiced for a man who had been a stranger to a woman's body for so many years. One night, as he held her after they were finished, his hand stroking her back in a slow, comforting circle, the realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't his language. He was speaking a dialect he had learned from someone else. This soothing, circular motion was not an instinct born of his affection for her. It was a memory of an action that had once soothed Maribel. The gentleness, the patience, the quiet murmurings, they were all echoes. He was reenacting a play whose lines he had learned by heart. Only he had cast Annabeth in the leading role. She lay still in his arms, her body rigid, a cold emptiness spreading through her chest. She had his body, she had his name, she had his sincere, guilt-ridden effort, but she did not have his instincts. She was living in the shadow of a love so profound that it had permanently shaped the way he moved, the way he touched, the way he comforted. He was giving her the best of himself, but the best of himself had been taught to him by another woman. She was sleeping with her husband, but Maribel's ghost was always there in the bed with them, a silent, knowing instructor. The ranch became a theater of avoidance. The 3 points of their triangle drew as far apart as the land would allow. Maribel was a wraith. She took her meals in the barn, rose before the sun to do her chores, and disappeared to the farthest pastures to mend fences that didn't need mending. Annabeth would sometimes catch a glimpse of her from a distance, a solitary figure moving with a dogged purpose, her back always turned toward the cabin. The red mark from Annabeth's slap had long since faded from her cheek, but a new, invisible brand of shame seemed to be seared upon her soul. Eli retreated even further into the fortress of his silence. He was a man stretched on a rack. At night, he dutifully played the part of the tender husband to Annabeth. By day, his gaze would drift toward the barn, a flicker of raw, unresolved pain in his eyes before he would catch himself and look away. He spoke to neither of them unless it was absolutely necessary. The air in the cabin grew thick and heavy, charged with unspoken words, with the grief of three people trapped in a cage of their own making. He was a man split in two, and the strain was hollowing him out, leaving him more haunted than when he had first returned from the war. The storm that broke the stalemate was a force of nature beyond anything they had ever seen. It was not a winter squall or a summer thunderclap. It was a deluge, an apocalypse of rain that began in the middle of the night and continued for 2 days without pause. The sky turned a bruised, permanent gray, and the rain fell in solid, blinding sheets. The dry creek bed that cut through their property swelled into a roaring, muddy river, its angry brown water tearing at the banks, pulling rocks and trees along with it. The first day, they were trapped, watching helplessly as the world outside dissolved into a brown, churning chaos. On the second night, the water crested the banks. They could hear the terrified bellowing of the cattle. Trapped in the lower pasture, there was no discussion. There was only action. The three of them burst from the cabin into the maelstrom, lanterns held aloft. The rain was a physical assault, and the rising water was shockingly cold, sucking at their boots. They worked in a frantic, desperate unison. Eli, with a rope tied around his waist and the other end secured to a sturdy pine, waded into the flood, his powerful shoulders set against the current, trying to drive the panicked cattle toward higher ground. Annabeth and Maribel worked on the bank, their personal animosity forgotten, their hands raw as they pulled on the rope, acting as his anchors, their shouted warnings and encouragements lost in the roar of the water and the wind. They fought for hours, a tiny, defiant trinity against the wrath of God. They managed to save more than half the herd, but they watched, helpless, as several cows were swept away, their terrified eyes wide in the lantern light before they were consumed by the flood. Just as they herded the last of the survivors onto the rise behind the cabin, they heard it, a terrible, groaning crack of timber, followed by a thunderous crash that was not thunder. The barn, the foundation, weakened by the relentless water, had given way. The whole structure had collapsed in on itself like a house of cards. They stood together in the downpour, soaked and exhausted, staring at the ruin of the building that had been a refuge, a workplace, and a silent witness to all their secret histories. They had saved the cattle, but they had lost the barn. The rain finally stopped the next morning, leaving behind a world wrecked and coated in a thick layer of brown sludge. The sun broke through the clouds, steaming the sodden earth. The scale of the devastation was immense. Fences were gone, tools were buried, and the collapsed barn was a tangled, dangerous heap of splintered beams and debris. But there was no time for despair. The work of rebuilding began immediately. For days, they worked from dawn until dusk, their bodies aching, their hands bleeding. They dragged beams, salvaged what tools they could find, and started the monumental task of clearing the wreckage. The shared, desperate labor burned away their personal drama, leaving only the raw, immediate need for survival. They were a team again, their movements economical, their communication clipped and efficient. It happened on the third day of the cleanup. They were trying to pry loose a massive central beam that had trapped the wagon beneath it. Eli was using a long pry bar, his muscles straining, the sweat running in rivulets down his dirt-streaked face. Annabeth and Maribel were on the other side, pulling at a smaller, connected crossbeam. "It's starting to give," Eli grunted, putting his shoulder into it. "A little more." With a final, agonized groan of stressed wood, the main beam shifted, but it didn't move the way they expected. The support beneath it, weakened and unseen, gave way completely. The entire section of the roof they were working on tilted, a massive, deadly weight sliding downward. "Look out!" Eli roared. He didn't run. In a split second, he saw the trajectory of the falling crossbeam, directly toward Annabeth. He lunged, not away, but toward her, shoving her hard. She stumbled backward, falling into the mud, out of the path of the falling timber. She looked up just in time to see the main support beam, a massive log of pine as thick as her waist, swing down like the arm of a vengeful god. It caught Eli across the back and shoulders, smashing him to the ground with a sickening crunch. For a moment, there was only a stunned, ringing silence. Then, both women screamed his name. They scrambled to him, their hearts seizing with terror. He was lying face down, partially pinned under the enormous weight of the beam, a dark pool of blood already beginning to spread from a gash on the side of his head. He was unnervingly still. "We have to get it off him," Maribel cried, her voice sharp with a command born of pure panic. Together, they heaved and strained against the impossible weight, their muscles screaming, their feet slipping in the mud. It wouldn't budge. Annabeth, sobbing, grabbed the pry bar and jammed it beneath the log, putting every ounce of her weight onto it. Maribel found a smaller piece of wood to use as a fulcrum. "Now!" she yelled. They threw their combined weight into the effort. The beam lifted. Just an inch. Just enough. Maribel, with a strength Annabeth didn't know she possessed, grabbed Eli by the collar of his shirt and dragged him clear. The beam crashed back down into the mud. He was alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow and ragged. They carried him between them, a dead weight, his head lolling, back to the cabin. They laid him on the big bed, the one he shared with Annabeth, and their war began anew, not against each other, but against the death that was hovering in the corners of the room. They became a single entity of care. Maribel, with her knowledge of herbs and wounds, took the lead. She cleaned and stitched the gash on his head with a firm, steady hand. She set his clearly broken arm with splints made from floorboards. Annabeth, following her every instruction, tore sheets for bandages, kept the fire going, and boiled water. They moved around each other without a word. Their former rivalry dissolved into a seamless, desperate partnership. For nights on end, they kept vigil. One would sleep in a chair by the fire while the other sat by the bed, bathing his feverish brow, forcing sips of broth between his cracked lips, listening to the strained rasp of his breathing. The world shrank to the confines of that small room, to the rise and fall of one man's chest. Eli drifted in a gray, feverish fog, lost in a world of pain and memory. He thrashed in the bed, his voice a low moan, his words a jumbled stream of consciousness. He spoke of battlefields, of cannon fire and the screams of dying men. He called out for his mother, and then, his delirium turned to the present. He began to call their names. "Annabeth," he would groan, his hand twitching on the blankets, searching for something. So cold, the water. A few minutes later, his head would turn on the pillow. "Maribel, the fire. Keep the fire lit." He was trapped between the two of them, his mind unable to distinguish between the wife who shared his bed and the widow who had shared his survival. They were intertwined in his broken consciousness, two halves of a single, necessary whole. On the fourth night, the fever peaked. He began to cry, not loud, ragged sobs, but the quiet, hopeless tears of a lost child. His eyes were squeezed shut, his face a mask of anguish. "Don't leave me," he whispered, the plea torn from the deepest part of his soul. "Please, don't leave me." He didn't say a name. The words were for the room, for the two women who sat in the lamplight, their face etched with exhaustion and fear. He repeated the words over and over, a desperate, broken mantra. "Don't leave me! Please, don't leave me!" Annabeth looked across the bed at Maribel. The older woman's face was wet with silent tears, her expression one of utter devastation. All the barriers between them, jealousy, betrayal, anger, guilt, crumbled to dust. In that moment, all Annabeth saw was another woman who loved this man as fiercely and as hopelessly as she did. Slowly, Annabeth reached out her hand across the blankets. Maribel looked at the offered hand, then up at Annabeth's face. She saw not a rival, but a fellow mourner at a premature grave. Her own hand, chapped and trembling, rose to meet Annabeth's, their fingers intertwined. It was the first time they had touched since the slap. This touch was not one of violence or even of forgiveness. It was a touch of pure, unadulterated solidarity, a quiet acknowledgement of their shared love and their shared terror. They held hands over the broken body of the man who bound them together, and they sat in silence, drawing strength from each other as they waited for the dawn. Eli's fever broke just as the first pale light of morning crept through the window. He stirred, and his eyes fluttered open. For the first time in days, they were clear. The fever fog had lifted. His gaze was weak, unfocused at first. It drifted around the room, taking in the familiar timbers of the ceiling, the dying lantern on the table. Then, it settled on the two women sitting by his bed. He saw their faces, pale and drawn with fatigue. He saw the tear tracks on their cheeks, and he saw their joined hands, resting together on the wool blanket that covered him. He saw Annabeth, his wife, the symbol of the new life he had tried to build. And he saw Maribel, his rescuer, the keeper of his history and his heart. He saw them not as two separate choices, not as a past he had to abandon and a future he had to force. He saw them as they were in that moment, a single, unified circle of protection around him. And for the first time with a clarity that was both a profound relief and a terrifying complication, Eli Quinn understood. It was not a question of choosing one over the other. It was an impossibility, like choosing to have a heart but no lungs. He needed them both. Eli's recovery was a slow, quiet dawn, as his body mended. So too did the fractured pieces of their lives begin to knit together in a way none of them had anticipated. There was no grand discussion, no negotiation of terms. A new reality simply settled over the ranch, as natural and irrefutable as the turning of the seasons. Maribel did not return to the barn. She took the small cot in the main room, and the cabin, once a space of tense divisions, became a shared home. They began to live as a family of three, a silent, unnamed entity bound by a love that had no definition in the world they knew. Their life fell into a new rhythm, a three-part harmony of shared labor and quiet companionship. In the mornings, it was Maribel who rose first, her movements sure and practiced as she coaxed the fire in the stove to life. Then Annabeth would emerge, no longer a stranger in her own home, but a partner, ready with the coffee pot and the skillet. Eli would join them last, his arm still in a sling, his movements stiff, and the three of them would eat their breakfast together at the small wooden table, the silence no longer heavy with resentment, but comfortable, filled with the simple peace of a shared existence. Annabeth learned the land from Maribel. The two women, once rivals, became a seamless team. Maribel taught Annabeth how to read the soil, which wild herbs were medicine and which were poison, how to milk the cow with a firm but gentle hand. Annabeth, in turn, taught Maribel the letters of the alphabet, her patient voice filling the evenings as she guided Maribel's work-roughened finger over the words in her book of poetry. They were no longer the wife and the widow. They were simply Annabeth and Maribel, two women who had found an unlikely and profound sisterhood in the heart of their shared love for one man. Eli watched them, a quiet, wondering look often on his face. He saw the easy way they worked together, the soft smiles they exchanged, the way Annabeth would bring Maribel a shawl when the evening grew cold. He had torn their lives apart with his indecision and his desires, and yet, from the wreckage, they had built something he could never have imagined. A home, a real one. He would still lie with his wife at night, but their intimacy had changed. It was less a lesson and more a quiet affirmation of their bond, a tenderness that now existed in the daylight as well as the dark. And sometimes, in the dead of night, he would wake and see the faint outline of Maribel on her cot across the room, and his heart would ache with a love so fierce and protective for them both, it felt like it might break his ribs. He was a man with two hearts, and somehow, miraculously, he had found a way to hold them both. But their fragile, self-contained world could not remain isolated forever. The land had its own laws, but the world of men had another set entirely, and it was only a matter of time before that world came calling. The first hint of trouble came on a supply run into town. It had been months since the storm, and their stores of flour, salt, sugar, and coffee were perilously low. Eli, his arm now healed enough for the journey, drove the wagon into the small, dusty settlement with Annabeth beside him. Maribel had insisted on staying behind, her eyes clouded with an old, familiar apprehension. The moment they stepped into Henderson's mercantile, Annabeth felt the change. A low hum of conversation among the three women gathered by the fabric bolts ceased abruptly. A silence fell over the store, a thick, judgmental quiet that was more damning than any shout. Mrs. Henderson, a woman who had always been kind to Annabeth, gave her a tight, pitying look before turning away to busy herself behind the counter. The other women stared, their gazes a mixture of contempt for Eli and a sorrowful condescension for Annabeth. They pulled their skirts aside as she passed, as if her presence might be a contagion. The whispers followed them, sharp and stinging as horseflies. That poor child, fresh from the east, with that woman, the widow, living right there in the cabin. No shame, a man living in open sin. Annabeth's cheeks burned with a hot, furious shame. She held her head high, her chin set in a defiant line, but inside she was trembling. Eli, seemingly oblivious, gave his list to Mr. Henderson, his voice calm and even. But Annabeth saw the tightening of the muscle in his jaw, the way his hand rested near the pistol on his hip. He felt it too. They paid for their goods and left, the silence of the store pressing in on their backs. The ride home was long and quiet. They had the flour and the salt, but they had also brought back a poison that no medicine could cure, the town's judgment. The whispers solidified into a formal condemnation a week later. They arrived on a Sunday afternoon, a grim delegation of 4 men on horseback, led by Reverend Miller. The Reverend was a tall, gaunt man, with eyes that burned with a righteous fire and a mouth that looked as if it had never known a smile. He was the town's moral compass, a man who saw the world in stark, unforgiving terms of salvation and damnation. The 3 of them were sitting on the porch, enjoying a rare moment of peaceful rest, when the riders appeared. Eli stood up slowly as they approached, his body language shifting from relaxed to wary. He stood at the top of the porch steps, a quiet and immovable guardian of his home. Annabeth and Maribel rose and stood behind him, a silent, united front. "Quinn," the Reverend said, his voice ringing with authority as he reined in his horse. He did not dismount. "We have come on behalf of the good, God-fearing folk of this community." "Reverend," Eli acknowledged, his voice a low rumble. "This is my property. State your business." "Your business is our business, when it becomes a stain on the moral fabric of this town." One of the other men, a deacon named Josiah, chimed in. Reverend Miller held up a hand to silence him. His fiery gaze swept over the 3 of them, lingering on Maribel with undisguised contempt before settling on Annabeth with a look of theatrical pity. "Son," he said to Eli, "we have heard disturbing reports. reports of a living arrangement that is an abomination in the eyes of the Lord. You took a good Christian wife, a pure young woman from a decent family. It is your duty to honor and protect her." "I do," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You do not," the Reverend thundered, his voice rising with pulpit fury. "You dishonor her. You force her to share her home with an adulteress, a woman of low character. You are living in sin, Quinn, and you are dragging this poor child down into the pit with you." Annabeth stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. "I am not being forced into anything," she said, her voice clear and steady. The Reverend ignored her, his eyes boring into Eli. "The community will not stand for it. We cannot abide this cancer of immorality in our midst. You will restore this young woman's honor. You will cast out the harlot, send the widow away. Return to a righteous path with your lawful wife. If you do not, you and this household will be cut off. You will be outcasts. The Lord's community will shut its doors to you." It was an ultimatum, delivered with the unassailable certainty of a man who believed God was on his side. Annabeth held her breath. Maribel seemed to shrink into herself, her face pale, her eyes cast down at the porch floorboards. This was her fault. She was the sinner, the harlot, the stain. Eli stood silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He looked at the vast, unforgiving land that had shaped him, at the rebuilt frame of the barn that symbolized his will to endure. He looked at the determined, fierce loyalty in Annabeth's face, and the quiet, heartbreaking strength in Maribel's. He had lived his life in shades of gray, a world of silence and survival. But this was a moment of stark, simple truth. He turned his gaze back to Reverend Miller. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud, but it carried across the yard with the finality of a closing door. "I love them both," he said. A shocked silence fell over the riders. The Reverend's jaw dropped. "What did you say?" he stammered, as if he could not have heard correctly. Eli's eyes were as clear and hard as winter ice. "You heard me," he said. "Annabeth is my wife. Maribel is my family. I love them both." He took a step forward, his presence suddenly immense, formidable. "If God is the one you speak of, a God of wrath and judgment who would ask a man to tear his own heart out, then he is not my God. If loving them is a sin," he finished, his voice dropping low, "then I choose to be the sinner. And if this community would cast us out for it, then I choose to be the outcast." He turned his back on them, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and walked back to stand between Annabeth and Maribel. He placed a hand on each of their shoulders. The Reverend, his face purple with fury and disbelief, sputtered for a moment, then wheeled his horse around. "So be it," he yelled. "May God have mercy on your corrupted souls." The four riders galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and condemnation in their wake. The ostracism was swift and absolute. When Eli next went to town for grain, Mr. Henderson stood before him, his face a mask of grim resolve. "I can't sell to you, Eli," he said, not meeting his eyes. "The Reverend was clear. The town council voted. Anyone who does business with you will be shunned themselves." They were cut off. The world had shrunk to the boundaries of their 100 acres. Their supply of coffee ran out. Then the sugar. The flour dwindled. Then the salt. They were an island, and the tide of winter was coming. They had their garden, their cattle, and a few chickens. They had the game Eli could hunt. They would survive. But it would be a hard, lean survival. The weight of it fell most heavily on Maribel. She saw the worry in Eli's eyes, the new, thin lines of strain around Annabeth's mouth. This was her doing. She was the adulteress, the harlot. She was the sin for which they were all being punished. Her presence was poisoning them, starving them. The guilt was a living thing inside her, gnawing at her day and night. She could not bear to be the cause of their ruin. One night, after the others were asleep, She made her decision. It was the same decision she had made before, but this time her resolve was absolute. Her love for them was so great that she had to leave them. She scribbled a crude, barely legible note on a scrap of paper. "I am sorry. It is for the best," and left it on the table. She bundled her few possessions, took a small portion of dried meat and a canteen of water, and slipped out of the cabin like a thief in the night. The moon was a cold, silver coin in the black sky as she started her long walk toward nowhere. She had not gone more than a mile when she heard a voice call out from behind her, sharp and clear in the still night air. "Maribel, stop right there!" It was Annabeth, running, her nightgown billowing around her, a rifle held firmly in her hands. She came to a halt a few feet from Maribel, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective light.
"I knew it,"
Annabeth panted.
"I had a feeling you would try this."
"You have to let me go, Annabeth," Maribel said, her voice breaking. "I am the cause of all this. If I am gone, the town will forgive you. You and Eli can have a life." "A life?" Annabeth's laugh was a short, bitter sound. What kind of life would that be? A life built on a lie? A life without a part of its own heart? She stepped closer, her gaze intense. "I have lost my father, my home, and every idea I ever had about what my life was supposed to be. I will not lose you, too."
"But I am the other woman,"
Maribel whispered, the town's ugly words branding her even in the darkness.
"The third person."
Annabeth shook her head, a profound and absolute certainty settling on her features. She reached out and took Maribel's hand, her grip strong and sure. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a truth that was more powerful than any sermon. "You are not the third person." She looked from Maribel's face toward the distant, dark shape of the cabin where their husbands slept. "We are one, you, me, him. We are a family, and you are not leaving your family." She turned and began to lead Maribel back toward the light of home, their hands clasped together, an unbreakable bond against the darkness. From that night on, they fought back. They did not rail against the town or curse their fate. They fought with their hands, with their sweat, and with their unyielding will. Eli, with the women helping him, began the arduous task of rebuilding the barn from the ground up. He hewed new logs, his axe ringing out in the silent air, a sound of defiance and creation. Annabeth and Maribel turned their attention to the earth. They found the old, rusted plow from the collapsed barn and, with one of the sturdier oxen, they broke new ground, extending the garden into a small field. They worked side by side from sun-up to sundown, their hands becoming calloused, their faces browned by the sun. They planted winter wheat and potatoes and beans, their movements a synchronized dance of survival. They were no longer waiting for the world to accept them. They were building their own world, a world that could sustain itself, a world with its foundations set not in the fickle judgment of men, but in the rich, dark soil beneath their feet. They were outcasts, yes, but they were outcasts together. And in their shared isolation, they were, for the first time, truly and completely free. The year that followed was forged in sweat, soil, and a shared, stubborn silence. The new barn rose from the ashes of the old, its timbers smelling of fresh-cut pine and determination. The expanded field, broken by their own hands, yielded a modest but vital crop of wheat and potatoes. They learned the rhythms of the land and of each other, their three lives braiding into a single, strong cord. They were an island, but they were their own self-sufficient world. The first sign of the change came not with a tremor, but with a quiet stillness. Annabeth, who had always had a boundless, youthful energy that propelled her through the long days, began to tire. She would pause in her work, a hand pressed to the small of her back, a faint shadow of exhaustion under her eyes. She started turning away from the smell of the morning coffee, her stomach suddenly delicate. Eli, consumed by the monumental task of their survival, noticed but attributed it to the hard labor. Annabeth herself thought it was simply the toll of their new life. But Maribel watched, And she knew. She recognized the subtle shifts, the almost imperceptible changes that a woman's body makes when it begins the sacred, secret work of creating life. She saw it in the new softness around Annabeth's waist, the slightly deeper color of her eyes. One afternoon, as the two women were weeding the garden under the hot summer sun, Annabeth suddenly swayed, her face pale. She sat down hard on the ground, pressing a hand to her forehead.
I'm sorry, she murmured. Just a wave of dizziness.
Maribel knelt beside her, her heart beginning to pound with a feeling she hadn't dared to feel in years. She placed a cool, gentle hand on Annabeth's belly. It was still flat, but Maribel could feel it, a nascent warmth, a tiny, miraculous spark. Her dark eyes met Annabeth's questioning gaze.
Annabeth,
Maribel whispered, her voice thick with a wonder that bordered on reverence.
when was your last?
Understanding dawned on Annabeth's face, followed by a wave of shock, disbelief, and then a slow, luminous joy. A hand flew to her own mouth, her eyes widening.
It can't be,
She breathed.
with all that has happened. I never thought.
Maribel didn't need to hear the rest. She saw the truth in the radiant hope that transformed the girl's face. And then, something inside Maribel, a part of her that had been frozen and dead since she had buried her own tiny, stillborn daughter under an aspen tree, broke open. A great, shuddering sob escaped her. Annabeth's joy instantly turned to concern.
Maribel? Are you not happy?
But these were not the tears of sorrow or jealousy. Maribel shook her head, laughing through the tears that streamed down her face. She pulled Annabeth into a fierce, tight embrace, burying her face in the younger woman's hair.
Happy?
She cried, her voice choked with an emotion so powerful it was painful. Oh, Annabeth, happy is too small a word. These were the tears she had never been allowed to shed for her own child, tears of a grief finally redeemed, of a hope she thought had been extinguished forever. A baby, their baby, a new life, born not of sin and violence, but of this strange, complicated, and powerful love. It was a miracle. It was their salvation. When they told Eli that evening, he stopped in the middle of sharpening an axe blade, the steel falling from his slack hand. He stared at Annabeth's belly, then at her glowing face, then at Maribel's tear-streaked, joyful one. He said nothing. He simply walked to them, his movement stiff with a profound, overwhelming emotion, and gathered them both into his arms. He held them, his wife and his family, the mother of his child and the keeper of his heart, and pressed his face between their heads, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, grateful tears. The child was a promise, a testament to the fact that even on the hardest, most unforgiving ground, life could find a way to bloom. The pregnancy solidified their strange family in a way nothing else could have. The child, though growing in Annabeth's womb, belonged to all of them. Maribel became its fierce, tender guardian. She brewed special teas for Annabeth's morning sickness, massaged her aching back, and sewed tiny garments from soft, worn-out flour sacks. Eli would talk to the baby through Annabeth's belly, his voice a low, gentle rumble as he told it stories of the land, of the hawk that circled in the sky, of the strength of the pine trees. It was a time of quiet, sacred joy within the borders of their isolated ranch. But beyond their fences, the land was dying. A brutal drought had settled over the territory. The sky remained a hard, metallic blue for months on end. Creeks dried up. The prairie grass turned to brown tinder, and the other ranchers in the valley began to watch their cattle grow thin and their wells turn to mud. The town's judgment felt very far away when people's children were crying from thirst. It was Maribel, with her deep, intuitive knowledge of the land, who remembered the old seep. It was a place far back in the hills, a spot her own father had shown her as a girl, where the water table was so high that a little digging would always reveal clean, sweet water. While the town's wells were failing, Eli, following Maribel's guidance, was able to fill barrels with precious water. At first, they kept it for themselves. But one day, a wagon appeared on their road. It was Josiah, the deacon who had ridden with the Reverend. His wife, Martha, sat beside him, her face a mask of desperation. Their youngest boy had a fever, and their well had been dry for a week. Josiah did not meet Eli's eyes. He looked at the ground, his hat in his hands, a man broken by thirst and fear. "Quinn," he mumbled, "I know what we said, but my boy, he's sick. We need water." Eli looked at Maribel. She simply nodded. They gave the man 2 full barrels, no questions asked, no payment demanded. Martha wept with gratitude. A few days later, another family came, and then another. The Quinn Ranch, the home of the outcasts, became an oasis. Maribel did more than offer water. She saw the chapped lips, the fevers, the hunger. She would send families away not just with water, but with a bundle of herbs to soothe a cough, a jar of potato soup, a poultice for a wound. She began to teach the children. The families would often wait for hours while Eli refilled their barrels, and Maribel would gather the ragged, sunburnt children on the porch. She would use a charred stick to draw letters in the dirt, patiently teaching them their ABCs, telling them stories. The woman they had called a harlot was the only school teacher their children now had. The townspeople began to look at her differently. They still wouldn't meet her eyes in a friendly way, but their gazes were no longer filled with contempt. They were filled with a grudging, desperate respect. The drought broke in the autumn, but it was replaced by a more terrifying plague, scarlet fever. It came silently at first, a child with a sore throat, a rosy rash. Then it swept through the valley like a prairie fire. The small, isolated homesteads, weakened by the drought, were helpless against it. There was no doctor for 100 miles. There was only panic and death. Maribel would not stand by and watch. She had seen too much death. "I know the herbs," she told Eli and a pregnant Annabeth, her face set with a grim resolve. "I know the teas to bring down the fever, the poultices to soothe the throat. I have to go." "No," Eli said, his voice firm. "It's too dangerous. For you, and for Annabeth and the baby." "And it is more dangerous to do nothing," Maribel countered, her gaze unwavering. "These are our neighbors. Their children are dying. I will not hide here while that happens." She went. Annabeth, her belly now round and full, stood on the porch and wept with a mixture of terror and a profound, aching pride as she watched Maribel ride away on one of their horses, a satchel of herbs and remedies slung over her shoulder. For 2 weeks, Maribel was a tireless angel of mercy. She moved from ranch to ranch, sleeping in chairs, barely eating. She brewed gallons of willow bark and elderflower tea. She forced liquids down parched throats. She bathed feverish bodies. She saved lives. The stories trickled back to the Quinn Ranch. The Henderson boy had pulled through. Josiah's youngest daughter was sitting up and eating again. The name Maribel was no longer spoken as a curse, but as a prayer. But her body was not invincible. Exhausted and worn down, she finally succumbed to the sickness herself. Josiah found her collapsed on the floor of a cabin where she had just saved 2 children. He brought her home, carrying her in his wagon as if she were a fallen queen. She was burning with fever, her breathing a shallow, ragged whisper, the telltale scarlet rash spreading across her skin. This time it was Eli and Annabeth who kept the vigil. Annabeth, despite her advanced pregnancy and Eli's protests, refused to leave her side. "She saved you," she told her husband, her voice fierce. "And she saved all those children. Now, we will save her." They fought for her life with a desperate, focused intensity. They used the very remedies she had taught them, forcing the teas between her lips, keeping her cool, willing her to live with every fiber of their being. For days, she hovered in the gray space between life and death. Eli sat by her side, holding her hand, his face a mask of grief, refusing to believe he could lose her again. Annabeth managed the household, her large belly a constant reminder of the life Maribel had so joyfully celebrated, her resolve like iron. She survived, slowly, painstakingly. They pulled her back from the brink. The fever receded. And one morning she awoke to find Eli asleep in the chair beside her and Annabeth carefully spooning broth into her mouth. She was weak, but she was alive. The community she had saved had, in turn, saved her by bringing her home. The sickness broke the back of the town's judgment forever. The Quinn Ranch was no longer a place of shame. It became a center, a gathering place for those who had been touched by Maribel's courage. Families would stop by not just for help, but to share news, to offer a portion of a butchered hog, to simply sit on the porch and talk. They had been cast out, and in their exile, they had become the heart of the very community that had rejected them. They had built their own church, a church of mutual aid and acceptance, on their small patch of land. Annabeth's son was born in the early spring, a healthy, lusty boy with Eli's dark hair and her own blue eyes. Maribel acted as midwife. Her hands, once associated with the death of her own child, now sure and steady as she brought this new life into the world, they named him Samuel, a good, strong name. He was a child of 3 parents, held in Maribel's arms as often as in his mother's, lulled to sleep by the deep rumble of Eli's voice. One evening in late summer, they sat together on the porch of their new barn. The world bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The field of wheat they had planted with their own hands was a sea of gold, ripe for harvest. Annabeth sat in a rocking chair, the sleeping Samuel in her arms, her hand resting gently on his small back. Maribel leaned against Eli's shoulder, her head resting in the familiar hollow, her gaze peaceful and content. Her hair was showing streaks of gray, and new lines were etched around her eyes, but they were lines of character, not sorrow. Eli looked out at the field, at the sturdy barn, at the 2 women and the child who were his entire world. The long, silent war within him was finally over. The pieces of his life, once so shattered and scattered, had come together to form a picture he could never have designed, but which was more beautiful and more true than any dream he had ever allowed himself to have. A small, quiet smile touched his lips. He reached out, his hand covering Maribel's where it rested on his arm, while his other hand came to rest on Annabeth's shoulder. He drew them both a little closer. "We survived," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of war, of storms, of sickness and exile. His gaze moved from the golden field to the faces of his family. "And we loved." Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to hear where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let us know. If you enjoyed this tale, consider subscribing to our channel, From Wild West, and share your thoughts.